Hi, everyone. My name is David Luchs, and I'm the Marquee team lead here at Ballotpedia. The 2022 general elections are just under 6 weeks from now, as the primaries are complete and early voting is even beginning in some states. This is a midterm election, which means there's no presidential election, but partisan control of so much else is on the ballot at the federal, state, and local level. Voters across the country will decide just over 1/3 of all seats in the US Senate, all US House districts, and just under 3/4 of governor's races. There's also many state executive and judicial offices, seats in 88 of the nation's 99 state legislative chambers, and local races, including county, municipal, and judicial positions. Now, to recognize Ballotpedia's 15th anniversary, we've selected 15 elections to watch this year. And to help me explain what those races are and how we did that is Dave Beaudoin, my fellow staff writer on the Marquee team. Thanks for being here, Dave.
Happy to be here, David.
So we've taken all of these elections and we've boiled them down to 15. I bet that was a pretty difficult process, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, if Ballotpedia was 150 years old and we were picking 150 elections to watch, it still would be very tough. The country is just really divided right now, and this manifests itself in so many areas. The US Senate is split 50-50. Democrats have a 5-seat majority in the US House currently. There are jurisdictions all over that are very evenly divided, such as state legislative chambers and state Supreme Courts and whatnot. So Ballotpedia's editorial department selected these races based on past election results. We also used unique election-specific circumstances and race ratings published by elections forecasters. And the final selections were made with the goal of including a mix of federal, state, and local races in mind. Our criteria for considering races as battlegrounds on the site are those elections that Ballotpedia expects to have a meaningful effect on the balance of power in governments or to be particularly competitive or compelling. And we have quite a few races designated as battlegrounds. But then we took that list and distilled it even further, which was pretty difficult.
All right, well, let's jump straight in. Starting with the US Senate, which is currently split 50-50. There are 4 contests for seats to the US Senate that actually made it onto our top 15 list. That's almost 1/3 of the list. As I've said, the Senate's split 50-50. The Vice President, Kamala Harris, sometimes casts the tie-breaking vote. So let's start with that landscape. What are those 4 races and what's at stake?
Yes, sounds good. So voters are going to decide 36 elections for 35 US Senate seats this year. There are 34 seats that are up for regular election, as 1/3 of the Senate is up every 2 years. And there are also 2 special elections. So one of those special elections is to fill the final 4 years of Senator Jim Inhofe's term. He had a 6-year term that began in 2021. He's a Republican from Oklahoma. He announced his resignation effective January 3rd, 2023, which is when the new class will take office. The other special election will fill the final weeks of the 6-year term that Kamala Harris was elected to in 2016. So that US Senate seat is also up for regular election this year. So essentially there's going to be 2 elections for the same seat. That's why there's 36 elections for 35 individual seats.
Fascinating. And I see we've identified 4 of those as battlegrounds. So we have on our list, or excuse me, as top 15, we have Arizona, we have Georgia, we have Pennsylvania, and we have Wisconsin. Let's start at the beginning of the alphabet with Arizona. So Democratic Senator Mark Kelly is running for re-election. What else is going on in that race?
Yeah, so you have Kelly, the Republican Blake Masters, and you also have a Libertarian candidate, Mark Victor, and they're running for one of Arizona's 2 US Senate seats. So Kelly took office in December of 2020 after defeating the incumbent Republican, Senator Martha McSally, which was a special election after Senator John McCain had passed away in 2018. So one of the reasons, this race has been incredibly close, and the history reinforces that. So the 2 most recent presidential elections in Arizona were very close. You had President Joe Biden won the state. He carried the state over President Trump, 49.4% to 49.1% in 2020. And then President Trump won the state in the 2016 presidential election, 48.7% to 45.1%. So This race, obviously the history in Arizona, it's a theme we're going to come to throughout this webinar. There are a lot of close races in Arizona this year that we're really following. Now, as of August, the 3 independent election forecasters that we follow rated the race a toss-up, but Larry Sabato's crystal ball and Inside Elections have both moved their rating to leans Democratic this month, but it still is going to be a race that will be watched very closely.
So the next one on our list is in Georgia. We know Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock is running for a full term. What can you tell us about Georgia?
Yeah, well, Georgia is also another state that there was a lot of interest from 2020, and that's just kind of rolled over into 2022. So Warnock won a special election in January of 2021, defeating the incumbent at that time, Kelly Loeffler, the Republican. And he won that race 51 to 49%. Now, this was after Georgia Governor Brian Kemp had appointed Loeffler to the seat in 2019 after former U.S. Senator Johnny Isakson, a Republican, had resigned due to health reasons. So Warnock has been serving the 2 years of that term. And then this is for the regular election for the 6-year term. And both Warnock and John Ossoff, who defeated Republican David Perdue, both won runoffs for both of the state's 2 Senate seats on the same day in January of 2021. And at that time, they became the first Democrats to represent Georgia in the U.S. Senate since 2005.
And one really interesting thing to note in Georgia is that a general election in Georgia will still advance to a runoff if the top 2 finishers advancing if no candidate receives more than 50% of the vote. And as you say, that happened in both races in 2020.
Yeah, correct. So just as in 2020, we may not know which party controls the U.S. Senate until early January of 2023, when that runoff election, if it's necessary, will be held.
Fascinating. Let's look at a couple of the races in the Northeast and Midwest, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. So these 2 races are actually somewhat similar.
Yes, they are. Pennsylvania and Wisconsin have a very similar profile. So both states are places where Republicans are defending a seat in a state that President Joe Biden won in 2020. And both Pennsylvania and Wisconsin are 2 of the 6 states that currently have 1 Democratic and 1 Republican U.S. Senator.
Well, let's start with Pennsylvania. What's going on in that race?
Yeah, so I live in Pennsylvania, so I've seen commercials for this election for months. You have John Fetterman, who's the Democrat. You have Mehmet Oz, who's a Republican. You also have 6 other candidates that are on the ballot that are running for this seat. And this is where the incumbent Republican was Senator Pat Toomey. He was first elected in 2010. He is not seeking re-election. So Fetterman is currently the Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania. He was elected on a joint ticket with the incumbent Governor Tom Wolf in 2018. And for Mehmet Oz, this is his first run for public office. He's a retired surgeon, and he hosted the Dr. Oz show on daytime television from 2009 to, I think, just earlier this year. And as we said before, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin are very, very close races statewide. The past 2 presidential elections in Pennsylvania were decided by less than 2 percentage points.
Wow. And rounding out our look at Senate races, let's turn to Wisconsin.
Yes, Wisconsin, again, very similar. Although here you do have an incumbent, U.S. Senator Ron Johnson, and he is running against the Democratic candidate who ironically happens to also be Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes. There's also a write-in candidate in the race. And Johnson, like Toomey in Pennsylvania, was first elected in 2010. At that time, he defeated the then incumbent Democratic Senator Russ Feingold. And then in 2016, he won the rematch of that race. So we said in Pennsylvania that the last 2 presidential elections were decided by less than 2 percentage points. In Wisconsin, they went one step better. The last 2 presidential elections were both decided by less than 1 percentage point. So in 2020, President Joe Biden won the state 49.5 to 48.8%. And then in 2016, President Trump carried Wisconsin 47.2 to Hillary Clinton's 46.5%. So statewide races in Wisconsin are even closer than they are in Pennsylvania. And we don't expect that to change.
Wow. Well, I imagine even whittling it down to 4 must have been really, really difficult. Were there any Senate races that just kind of almost made the cut, but didn't quite make it onto the top 15? I mean, in particular, I'm thinking of the races in Ohio, Nevada. What were the runners up, so to speak?
Yeah, those two were definitely the ones that just missed the cut, although there are some others you could consider as well. And the 2 seats you mentioned, Ohio and Nevada, are currently represented by a Republican and a Democrat, respectively. So in Ohio, you have the Democrat is Congressman Tim Ryan. You also have the Republican is J.D. Vance, and those are the 2 candidates running. The incumbent Senator Rob Portman, who was first elected in 2010, is not running for re-election. So the interesting thing about Ohio is that all of the partisan state executive officers are Republicans, but that is another one of the states. We mentioned Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. This is a 3rd state that has a split U.S. Senate delegation. One senator is Democrat and the other is Republican. So you have the Republican is Rob Portman, who's currently representing, and Sherrod Brown is the Democrat. In Nevada, you have the incumbent U.S. Senator is Catherine Cortez Masto, and she's running against the former state Attorney General Adam Laxalt, who's the Republican, and there are 3 other candidates that are running. And this is a battle between 2 former attorneys general in the state. So voters are very familiar with both candidates. They've both run and won statewide. This is the seat that Senator Harry Reid held for 30 years, and recent statewide elections in Nevada have been decided by 5 percentage points or fewer. So this is another place that could have made the cut, but it just shows you how close and how many close U.S. Senate races there are.
I just keep thinking back to what you said just a few moments ago about how it would be hard if we were doing a top 150 elections to watch list. Sticking with statewide races, though, let's move over to some gubernatorial contests. So at this point, we're heading into the 2022 elections. There are 28 states that have Republican governors. There are 22 states that have Democratic governors. And this year, 36 states in total are electing a governor. And that's 20 states that have a Republican, and 16 that have a Democrat. Lots going on. What would you say is kind of at stake with the governor races on the list?
Yeah, this is always the fascinating part about midterm elections, is when you don't have a presidential race on the ballot, you have almost 3/4 of the gubernatorial seats that are on the ballot. So there's just so many different things happening. As most people are familiar, governors are the head of the executive branch in their respective states. Governors have various amounts of power or amounts of authority depending on the state constitution, but they're really important statewide races. I personally think that most people are probably, second most familiar with who their governor is after knowing who the president of the United States is. So these are really high profile offices. They have a lot of effect on policy. And we have 4 of these elections on our top 15 list. 3 of those are currently held by Democratic governors, and 1 is currently held by a Republican.
Well, we started with Arizona when we looked at Senate seats, and Arizona's governor's race also made it onto this list. So let's start there. What's going on in the Arizona gubernatorial election?
Yeah, so we'll be coming back to Arizona multiple times because, as I said in the beginning, and as we've talked about, it's just a place where the elections have been really, really close, and they're expected to be that way again. So currently in the governor's race, you're going to have Democratic Katie Hobbs. The Republican candidate is Carrie Lake. There's a Libertarian candidate, Barry Hess, and there's also an independent Green Party candidate, Williams Pounds. And they're all running. The incumbent governor, Doug Ducey, is not able to run for re-election due to term limits. So Hobbs is this current Secretary of State. She was first elected to that position in 2018 after previously serving in the Arizona legislature from 2011 to 2019. And Lake is a former news anchor with Fox 10 News, which is the Fox News affiliate in Phoenix. Now, 2 polls that were conducted in August had different candidates leading the race, but they were well within the margin of error. So Lake led one poll 47 to 46%. Hobbs led the other 47 to 44%. And actually before this webinar, I saw that there was another poll that also had a 1% difference between the two. So this really is going to be a very close race and may not even be decided on election night.
Wow. Well, let's move east to our next state.
Yeah, so moving east to Kansas, which is a fascinating election for governor, and I think all of these are fascinating. This is the only governorship that the Democrats are defending this year in a state that President Trump won in 2020. So the incumbent is Democrat Laura Kelly. She's running against the Republican is Derek Schmidt. The Libertarian candidate is Seth Cordell, and there's an independent candidate, Dennis Pyle. Kelly was elected, as we said, governor in 2018 as the incumbent, defeating the Republican Chris Kobach 48% to 43%. At the time, Kobach was Secretary of State, who had defeated the incumbent governor, Jeff Collier, in the Republican primary by just 343 votes, or 1/10 of a percentage point. It was an unbelievably close race in the 2020 cycle. So before becoming governor, Kelly served in the state Senate from 2005 to 2019. Schmidt is the current attorney general. So again, both candidates are extremely well known. And just like the previous race that we talked about with the Arizona governor's race, all three election forecasters have rated this race as a toss-up. There's really very little separating the two candidates at this point.
Well, the third race to mention is Nevada, and I'm noticing Nevada, like Arizona, is a state that we seem to be talking about quite a lot today.
Yeah, we are. And it's, Nevada is sometimes, it's considered to be one of those purple states. It does switch back and forth between voting for Democrats, voting for Republicans. Same with Pennsylvania, same Wisconsin. You can get the sense that we're talking a lot about these states that kind of swing back and forth. So in Nevada, you have the incumbent Steve Sisolak is running against the Republican Joe Lombardo. There's also an independent candidate, Edward Bridges II, and there's a libertarian candidate, Brandon Davis. So Sisolak, like Kelly, was first elected governor in 2018 over Adam Laxalt, who is now running for Senate. So again, very familiar statewide offices. And that election was pretty close, 49% to 45%. Sisolak previously served on the Nevada Board of Regents and also on the Clark County Commission. Clark County is the largest county in the state. It includes Las Vegas. Lombardo served in the military. He was in the U.S. Army, the Army Reserves, the National Guard, and he also represented Clark County, but as sheriff, where he was elected in 2014. So both of these candidates are very familiar to voters in the largest county in the state. And that contributes to why this is going to be a very close race. So Nevada has voted for the Democratic candidate in the last 4 presidential elections, including in 2020 when President Biden carried the state by about 2 percentage points. But before Sisolak won in 2018, Republicans had held the governor's office continuously since 1999. So this is a state that doesn't have a problem voting for a Republican governor and maybe voting Democratic at the presidential level, which is indicative of just how evenly divided the state is.
Yeah, and finally we have Oregon. Oregon, I mean, maybe we're not supposed to pick favorites. Oregon is my favorite out of this list. I mean, what a fascinating race that is. This is a 3-way race with an independent candidate who's been polling very well. Bring us up to speed on what's been going on in Oregon, because it's really interesting.
Yeah, as you said, this is really, I think, the best for last. This is also going to be incredible to follow. You have the Democrat is Tina Kotek. You have the Republican is Christine Drazen, and the independent candidate is Betsy Johnson. All 3 of those women are current state senators. You also have a libertarian candidate, Leon Noble. And this is also a state where the incumbent governor is term limited, like Arizona. Katie Brown cannot run for re-election. So you have an open seat. Now you've had multiple polls in this race, but 3 recent polls that I was reviewing earlier had 2 of the 3 candidates at around 30%, and the other candidate is around 20%. But in each of the polls, which candidate was in which category was different, which really just shows you how wide open it is. And there's been anywhere from 15 to 25% undecided in the polls that we've been looking at. So this race is still really volatile and still could change. Now, the last time Oregon voted for a Republican presidential candidate was 1984. The last time Oregon voted for a Republican senator was 2002. So you can see that this is a state that I think a lot of folks look at as Democratic, but the presence of the independent candidate is having an effect. And also for the gubernatorial races, they have not been large margins. So for example, when Katie Brown won re-election in 2018, she defeated the Republican Newt Bueller 50% to 44%. So that was a relatively close race. And now that you have the third candidate in there, this one, I don't know anybody who's made a definitive prediction who feels all that comfortable about it.
Just fascinating. And if Johnson were to win, she would be the first independent candidate to win an election for governor in any state since Bill Walker in Alaska. And that was 2014. That was almost a decade ago.
Yes. And before that, there was Lincoln Chafee, who was elected governor of Rhode Island in 2010. And then, of course, one of my vote for the most interesting race in the last 20, 30 years was when Jesse Ventura was elected governor of Minnesota. He was actually the Reform Party candidate, but that was an amazing three-way race. And that was all the way back in 1998, which was, over 20 years ago, but it doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, wow, really fascinating. Let's shift back to federal elections for a bit and look at the House of Representatives, where all 435 seats are going to be up for election. As a result of the 2020 elections, Democrats maintained the majority they had heading into the elections that year. They won 222 seats. Republicans won 213. Currently, Democrats hold a 221 to 212 advantage of the U.S. House. There are 2 currently vacant seats. Republicans would need to gain a net 5 districts to win a majority in the chamber. The 2022 election is also interesting in the House because it will be the first election to take place under new district lines following the round of apportionment and redistricting that took place after the 2020 census. So I bet picking House races for this list was pretty tough this year.
Yeah, it's a consistent theme, but yeah, it was very tough. And as you mentioned, redistricting really complicated things because in some cases the districts were significantly changed, in others they were not so much. But in a lot of places, some of these districts have really been remapped, and the voters are sometimes seeing candidates for the very first time, even if it's a person that was an incumbent in that district because they represented another part of it. So that's what makes this even more complicated in the election right after redistricting. So currently there are 13 races that all 3 election forecasters have rated as toss-ups. And there's another 15 districts where 2 of the 3 forecasters have rated it as a toss-up. And we've identified 36 U.S. House races as battlegrounds. But we really just picked 2 for this list, mainly because we just had so many other races in the other categories that we wanted to get to. So the 2 races that we picked were in Colorado's 8th congressional district, where the Democrat is Yadira Caraveo, the Republican is Barbara Kirkmeyer. There's 3 others that are running. And what's interesting about this race is that it's one of 7 of the new congressional districts that was created after the 2020 census. Colorado previously was apportioned 7 seats in the U.S. House. They were apportioned 8 after the census. And this is the first new congressional district in Colorado since 2001. So what's really interesting about this district is if you look at the voter registration numbers as of the beginning of this month, 27% of the district's active registered voters are Democrats, 24% are Republicans, and 46% are unaffiliated. So this is a race that it clearly was drawn to be a swing district, and it surely will likely behave that way. So there was an analysis of some of the statewide elections that have been held after the boundaries were drawn. So look at 8 statewide elections that were held for between 2016 and 2020, and it found that the Democrats won by an average of those 8 statewide races by an average of about 1.3 percentage points. So you can see it's going to be likely be very, very close. The other district that we have selected for this list is all the way across the country. and it's in New Hampshire's first district. Incumbent Chris Pappas is the Democrat. Caroline Leavitt is the Republican candidate who is running. Now, this district was slightly redrawn after redistricting, but not by much. New Hampshire's redistricting was really minimal changes. So, because they only have 2 districts, and they really only, had to divide them one into the other. So, what's interesting about this district is the first district is one of 31 U.S. House districts that President Trump won in 2016, and the Democratic candidate then won in 2018 in those midterms. And what's also fascinating about this district is that from 2010 to 2016, the first district switched its partisan affiliation between the Democrat and the Republican 4 times. So this really is the quintessential swing district. It moves back and forth between the parties. That's why we felt we had to put it on this list, because it really should function as a district where you'll see how the partisan balance between the 2 parties is moving.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Well, moving on from House races, there's been a lot of media attention this cycle on some of the other state executive offices besides the governorship races for Attorney General, Secretary of State. And I see we actually have one such race that made it onto our top 15 list. And surprise, surprise, it looks like it's in Arizona. Yeah, what's the scoop on the Arizona Secretary of State race?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there's been a lot of media attention to these other state executive races. They have a role in various policy areas, such as redistricting, which we saw over the last couple of years, and election administration. Attorneys general often, and even the governor sometimes, has involvement in litigation on topics ranging from abortion to education policy to immigration. So in total, including gubernatorial races, there are 307 state executive seats that will be decided by voters in 44 states this year. And these state executives have various roles. They vary from state to state. And they also implement and enforce laws made by the state legislature. They have various executive functions and whatnot. So we highlighted the Secretary of State office, which exists in 47 out of 50 states. And they often serve as the chief executive official. They administer the elections, they maintain the official election results, maintain official voter registration records, and so forth. And there are 27 of those elections for Secretary of State that are happening this year. 14 of those positions are currently held by Republicans, 13 are currently held by Democrats.
So I know we're highlighting in particular the Secretary of State race in Arizona, and that was a state that was very close in the 2020 presidential election. Joe Biden won Arizona, but the margin was 49.4% to 49.1%. I think only Georgia had a narrower margin in that race.
Yeah, that's true. Biden carried Georgia by 0.2 of a percentage point, 49.5 to 49.3%. But we've been talking about Arizona a lot. This is one more race that's going to be fascinating. So you have an open seat race because the incumbent, Katie Hobbs, if you recall, the Democrat, is running for governor. So this is an open seat race where you have Adrian Fontes as the Democrat running against the Republican Mark Fincham. Hobbs had won her election for Secretary of State in 2018 by, wait for it, less than a percentage point, 50.4% to 49.6%. And before that year, the Republican Party had held this office since 1994. So Hobbs's win, was very, very close, indicative of how close elections in Arizona are becoming. Fontes is an attorney who served in the United States Marine Corps and was the Maricopa County recorder from 2016 to 2020. Maricopa County is, again, the largest county in the state. That's where Phoenix is. Fincham is a rancher and a former police officer and software company executive, and he's been a member of the Arizona House of Representatives since 2015. So those are the 2 candidates here in this race. But as you mentioned, there are a handful of Secretary of State races that we could have designated. We certainly have designated a bunch as battlegrounds. And those are in states like Georgia, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, New Mexico, and Wisconsin. We're tracking like 7 or 8 of these, and they are getting a lot of increased attention. But in a lot of cases, they are going to be pretty close.
All right. Well, that covers 11 of the top 15 races on our list. Got 4 more to go. Let's look at some of the others. We've got 2 legislative chambers, state legislative chambers, that made it onto our list. What can you tell us about those?
Yes, we've been talking a lot about individual races for statewide offices and U.S. House and so forth. But there's also just so many state legislators that are going, or state legislative districts that are going to be up for election. So there are 99 state legislative chambers across the United States, and there are elections for either all or part of 88 of them. So that's quite a few. And the elections in those chambers represent 6,278 of the 7,383 state legislative seats. So it's roughly 85% of the state legislatures across the country are up for election this year. So heading into this year's elections, Republicans currently control 54% of all of those state legislative seats nationally. Democrats hold 44%. The remainder are held by candidates who are either independent or, other parties. And then if you look at it on a chamber basis, Republicans have a majority in 62 legislative chambers, and Democrats have the majority in 36 chambers. And then there's 1 chamber in Alaska in the House of Representatives that's currently operating under a, partisan sharing agreement.
Yeah, it's really just a tremendous amount of races on the ballot this year. And with just that sheer number of elections, I think it's probably fair to expect that there will be many, many close individual state legislative races. Just looking at some of the stats we had prepared, we had in 2020, 30 state legislative races. There were 5,875 races that year. There were 30 that came down to fewer than 100 votes. And if you go back to 2018, the last midterm year, they had 6,073 seats up, and there were 105 that were decided by fewer than 100 votes. And it's probably fair to expect that there will be a pretty similar number this year, right?
Oh, absolutely. And if we were looking at just like super close races, we would flood this list with individual state legislative races that could have made it. But for a little more context, at Ballotpedia, we focus on legislative chambers rather than the specific races when we're looking at the overall context. So we've identified 2 chambers that we think are really significant that made this list, although there are going to be others that will be close. Surprise, surprise, one of them is in Arizona. And in the Arizona House of Representatives, Republicans have held 31 of the 60 seats since after the 2018 elections. So that means Republicans have a 2-seat majority over the last 4 years. This year in 2022, all 60 of the seats are going to be up for election. If Republicans lose fewer than 2 net seats, they'll maintain their control. If Democrats win 3 net seats, they're going to flip the chamber. So as you can see, really tight margin. Now, Arizona has been under a Republican trifecta since 2009 when Jan Brewer became governor, and Republicans have held majorities in both legislative chambers since 1993. And as you see on the graph, some of those margins, some of those majorities have been relatively large, and it's really narrowed as we've moved towards the present day. And Arizona voters are also going to decide all 30 seats in the state Senate this year. And as we mentioned before, the governor's race.
Wow, really, really a lot on the ballot this year. I know you mentioned the Arizona Senate and how all 30 seats will be up. And the Republican margin there is also quite thin. It's a 16-14 majority. So really, really just narrow control of that chamber. How do we expect that these races are going to be impacted by redistricting?
Yeah, this is another one of those things where we talked about the U.S. House races, where redistricting throws just that little bit of wild card, just that little bit of uncertainty into the whole situation. So we don't know specifically exactly how redistricting will affect individual races. I mean, that would kind of go beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. But just as on a broad note, Arizona's new legislative maps were enacted in January, and Arizona uses a independent redistricting commission, a non-legislator, non-members of the state legislature. And there were 5 members of the commission. There was the way the vote went was 3-2. The 2 Republican members plus the commission's sole nonpartisan member voted to approve the maps, and the commission's 2 Democratic members were opposed to the maps. So there wasn't exactly unanimity when they approved these, but I don't necessarily know, or I don't necessarily think you should interpret that to mean that these won't just be very close districts. Obviously, with redistricting, each party tries to kind of get whatever advantage they can, but redistricting will be a wild card. We don't know exactly how it will affect these races. We'll obviously have a little bit more information for the 2024 elections after we see the results from here. But right now, we're just going to have to wait and see.
Yeah, redistricting really has been just a fascinating process to watch unfold over the past couple of years. So the other chamber that made it onto our list was the Colorado State Senate.
Yeah, it's right next door. And this is a situation that sort of is a mirror image of Arizona. So Democrats have a 21-14 majority right now in the Colorado State Senate. Colorado is also under a Democratic trifecta, which has been in place since 2019, because they also control or have a majority in the state house. So in the Colorado State Senate, it's 35-member body, but only 17 seats are up for election this year. And of those, the Democratic Party currently controls 8 of them. The Republican Party currently controls 9 of them. So if the Democratic Party loses no more than 3 net seats in the state Senate, they'll maintain control of the chamber. And as long as they lose fewer than 9 net seats in the state house and maintain control of the governorship, they'll keep their trifecta. Whereas if the Republican Party can flip 4 or more seats in the state Senate, obviously it'll be a little bit harder because they'd have to flip 9 seats in the state House. They will break that trifecta. So this will be a very closely watched situation. And this is another state where the redistricting was done by a citizen commission. And in the case of the state Senate map, that map was approved unanimously. So Colorado Politics wrote that the new maps created 9 House districts where the previous election results fell within a 5 percentage point, and 8 Senate districts where that happened. So the purpose of the Colorado redistricting, or the focus of the Colorado redistricting, as we saw with Colorado 8 at the US House level, was to create competitive districts. And I imagine we're going to see a lot of competitive districts here.
All right, well, we've got just 2 more races to go on our list, one judicial and one local. Let's look at the judicial one. That is elections for the Ohio Supreme Court. So there are actually 3 Republican justices who have seats up for partisan election. So what can you tell us about those races?
Yeah, we really wanted to include one of these races on the list because state Supreme Courts are becoming much more prominent. And sometimes, or historically, maybe they haven't gotten the same level of attention, but that's increasing. And actually 30 states are holding state Supreme Court elections this year. And in total, 84 of the 344 seats on various state Supreme Courts across the country are going to be up for election this year. Now, of those seats, 64 of them are held by justices that are nonpartisan, because not every state holds party designations for their state Supreme Court justices. 12 of those seats are currently held by Republican justices, and 8 are held by Democratic justices. So there is a subset there where there is a partisan nature to this. Now, currently, Ohio Supreme Court is made up of 4 Republican justices and 3 Democratic ones. And what really makes this interesting, in addition to some of these other factors, is that this will be the first year where in Ohio Supreme Court election, the candidates will have their party designation listed next to their name. So that is something that is new this year. And according to an analysis by Bolt magazine, Ohio is one of 4 states where the partisan balance of the state's highest court could change as a result of this year's elections. the other ones being Illinois, Michigan, and North Carolina. So there will undoubtedly be a lot of focus on these races. And from what I've seen in recent polling, these Ohio races in particular will be very, very close.
Wow. Well, finally, rounding out our top 15 is a municipal election. And normally we kind of focus more on municipal elections in the odd numbered years or at different times throughout the year when there are fewer other elections on the ballot. But the nation's second largest city, Los Angeles, is holding its mayoral election in November this year. And I think we just couldn't resist putting it on the list. What can we expect to see in that race?
Yes, exactly. We really felt like we wanted to put this on the list to remind voters, obviously, that in their particular jurisdiction, they may also likely have local races or county level races and so forth. This is the first even year election for mayor of Los Angeles after voters passed a charter amendment back in 2015 that moved city elections from odd numbered years to even numbered years. And that began 2 years ago with some council races, and then it's obviously manifesting itself this year with the mayor's race. So the two candidates, it's a nonpartisan election. The two candidates are Karen Bass and Rick Caruso. They're the ones that advanced from the primary in June 7th. Neither candidate obviously received 50% of the vote. In the primary, Bass received 43.5% and Caruso received 36%. Bass is currently a member of the U.S. House. Caruso has been involved in various city boards, and I believe he's involved in real estate. So these two candidates have been on the airwaves in the Los Angeles area for quite a while, since even before the June 7th primary. And this is a case where the incumbent mayor, Eric Garcetti, could not run for re-election due to term limits.
Wow, seems like a really interesting race. Well, thank you for coming on, Dave, and sharing all this information about these 15 races, and as well as plenty of others that we talked about along the way. It really makes for just a fascinating several weeks leading up to when the results are going to become available starting November 8th.
Indeed, it's going to be interesting. And thanks again for having me on.
And we apologize for not being able to take your questions today. We just had so much material to cover. If you do have any questions, though, please do email them to editor@ballotpedia.org, and we will get you an answer. Thank you also to Lauren, our communications associate, for the presentation that was a part of today's briefing. And I hope you all enjoyed this election preview and analysis of our top contests to watch. If you're new to Ballotpedia, this is the level of analysis that we do on lots of different topics each year. We've already done analyses on topics like state legislative competitiveness and trifecta vulnerability. We'll have much more based on this year's election results. We've already started to look ahead to 2023, when there won't be any scheduled congressional elections, but there will still be noteworthy local elections in many areas. We're also beginning to ramp up our coverage of policy matters at the federal and state level and the beginnings of the 2024 presidential election. Ballotpedia relies on donations for all that we do. So if you like our work and want to support us, please consider donating if you can by going to www.ballotpedia.org/donate. And you can stay updated on what we're doing by regularly visiting our homepage, ballotpedia.org, where you can find the latest political news and links to our major coverage areas and analyses. Another way to stay informed is through our newsletters, which cover topics ranging from election policy to the federal courts and lots more. There's a link on our homepage to a full list of the newsletters we offer. Have a great day, everyone, and thanks for watching.